What up? What up? Okay, here's our second screencast. And this time we're going to go over principles of Constitution. I hope you're having a great day without me. It's a Friday. I would put on the Friday song, but it's absolutely horrific in my opinion. But this set of notes is of vital importance. Eventually, you're going to have to know all the key checks and balances in our constitutional democracy. As you already know, we have a separation of powers between three very important branches of government. As you will see through these notes, and as I've talked about frequently, is a lot of these checks or a lot of these powers are given to the legislative branch originally. So you'll see in looking at the document, they have a lot more than the other two branches, but it doesn't mean the other two branches don't have important checks as well. So let's focus on some of the checks and balances that the legislative branch has. We talked about impeachment. So we'll talk about the checks on the executive branch or the presidency. Impeachment is a power that is used very rarely in the history of the United States, and the House has the ability to impeach. That doesn't mean that you're removed from office. It simply means that the House of Representatives has found that you have done something very bad while in office. Very few presidents have gone through this process. A few have been impeached. Most of the time, you see judges impeached and removed from office. House has the impeachment power to find some executive branch official to have done something wrong, but again, that doesn't mean they're removed from office. If they're impeached by the House, it moves to a trial in the Senate. The Senate trial determines whether you're removed from office, and again, that has rarely happened in the history of the United States. So just be sure to understand or differentiate between impeachment and then the trial of impeachment and the power that the two chambers of the legislative branch have. It's not the same. We'll get into electoral votes again. This here has not happened very often, which is the president is decided by the House should there be a tie in the electoral college. Again, you don't need to know this one for this unit. Eventually you will. But I think this has happened one time in the history of the United States, very early on. Now, with the number of electoral votes, it'd have to be a 269 to 269 tie in the electoral vote for the presidency. I mean, what are the odds that that is going to happen? When Baby Bush or George W. Bush won the first time against Al Gore, there was maybe a 5 or 6 point difference or electoral college difference. So that's probably the closest it's been since. An override of a presidential veto. Someone asked earlier in the week in one of my classes why that doesn't occur more often. Well, you need a supermajority to override a presidential veto. So a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. Very, very difficult to do because one party hardly ever has that much of an advantage in either of the chambers of the legislative branch. Right now, the House of Representatives, the Republicans have a huge advantage, but it's not quite a 2/3 advantage. So very difficult to do, have that sort of advantage in both the House and the Senate, and then have a president of a different party. When I talk about departmental appointments, I'm talking about appointments, secretary appointments to the different departments in the executive department: Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, Department of the State. The executive or president makes the appointments to these departments, and they're approved by the Senate. Again, the key here is the Senate approves. They approve treaties and ambassadors to other countries. So you may be the ambassador to Ireland, you may be the ambassador to Israel. Those ambassadors are approved, and very rarely do you see much resistance from the Senate in regards to ambassadors. Treaties are formal agreements between the President of the United States, usually started by the Department of State, the Secretary of State, and those would need to be approved by the Senate as well. Again, not very common. There are ways in which you can get around having a formal treaty with another country, that is seen in regards to our negotiations with Iran. This is not a treaty, it's an executive agreement. It could end up being a formal treaty. That's playing out right now in the news. Approval of replacement of the vice president, if that should occur, doesn't happen often. Power to declare war. That one's a really interesting one because to enter into war, you need approval by the legislative branch. That has not occurred since World War II. Now, the executive branch presidents have entered into conflicts, sent troops without a formal declaration. That is something that can occur, and we'll talk about later on why that is able to happen. The power to enact taxes, allocate funds. This is huge. We call that power of the purse. So the executive branch and all the departments oftentimes want to enact policy. When you talk about enacting Obamacare, you need money to do that. So the legislative branch really has a lot of power over the departments and the executive branch by saying, hey, you're going to negotiate, or we're going to talk about what you're going to do if you want any money to do what you're going to do. This is one of the things that can kind of counteract when the president sends troops. If you send troops into war, you need money to do it. But oftentimes that puts a lot of pressure on the legislative branch. They oftentimes will give money because they don't want to be accused of not supporting the troops. State of the Union address, we'll talk about that later. It is something the president does once a year. It is a report to the legislative branch. It's become kind of political lately. Checks that the legislative branch has on the judiciary. Again, Senate approval of federal judges, Supreme Court, Circuit Court of Appeals, District Court. All of those judges that are appointed have to be approved by the Senate. You'll notice the Senate approved judges, the Senate approves department appointments up here, and the Senate approves treaties and ambassadors. Senate approves. The House does not approve. Very crucial that you know that. Think about Senate and the S in Senate. They are the superior chamber in Congress in regards to approving executive appointments. The Senate approves. The Senate approves. The Senate approves. They can impeach judges. We talked about impeachment a little earlier. They can initiate constitutional amendments. So if they don't like a decision that the judiciary makes, they can go ahead and propose a constitutional amendment. As we know, there's only been 17 after the first 10 Bill of Rights were passed. So 17 amendments have occurred since this Constitution was passed. So very, very rare. They set the courts that are inferior or below the Supreme Court. In the Constitution, it just mentions the Supreme Court. Congress actually established the lower layers, which are, again, the Circuit Court of Appeals right below the Supreme Court and the district courts below the Circuit Court of Appeals. We'll talk about those more in detail in Unit 5. Set jurisdiction, that means what powers the courts have at the lower level. There are military courts that deal with anything that happens in the military, which is different than criminal courts since that is on federal lands. They could alter the size of the Supreme Court, but that hasn't happened until, well, gosh, I don't know if it was the late 19th century or early 20th century. So that's unlikely to happen. The legislative branch has a self-checking mechanism because they are bicameral, meaning it's kind of a self-check. The House can pass a bill, and the Senate kind of looks at the bill and says, you know what, that's a good bill or that's a bad bill. And so they do have power within that branch. It's kind of a self-check. This is very important. The House must originate revenue bills. So any bill dealing with money starts in the House of Representatives. Again, if you recall, the House was closest to the people originally, the only part of the government directly elected. So that's probably why they put in there that when you're dealing with money and taxation of the people, it's got to be approved by the branch of government that's closest to the people. These last two you don't need to worry about. 30 seconds left, remember? So I'm not going to do this little countdown. Part 2 will deal with the executive branch and judiciary. Hope we're having a good time. It's always good fun listening to Mr. Dowdy on the Screencast Etos. Peace.